to be here.
Great, great. Well, before we get into the concept of the commons, David, I wanted to ask you, how did you first come to learn about this concept? What made you embrace it? What really drew you to this kind of work that you do?
Well, in the 1970s and 80s, when I was working for Ralph Nader, all of my friends were fighting what I would now call enclosures of the commons, meaning privatization and commodification of things like federally funded research and public lands and the airwaves, which are used by broadcasters for free, and so forth. And all of these were being taken private. But we really didn't have a language for talking about this. And it wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s when I realized, first of all, I encountered the work of Elinor Ostrom, a great scholar on the commons, and I realized that the commons was a great way to describe how things get done outside of the market and state, meaning through self-organized activities and self-governance to manage projects that create things of value. And I realized at a time when neoliberal capitalism and policies were getting worse and worse, it was essentially colonizing, taking over all of these commons in our life. Not only the resources that belong to us, but our ability to self-manage them for our benefit. They were basically being appropriated by the corporate world for global trade and turned into private property. So I realized that the commons had great potential as an alternative political vision that is not sort of some unified movement or ideology like in the past, but something that is locally distributed and grounded in things that people love and want to protect. So the commons is about sharing those things that belong to all of us that we want to protect and our ability to manage them for our purposes.
Right. So there are shades in there of, it seems like you started maybe with intellectual property, actually, as a kind of way of thinking about the commons, because normally I would think a lot of people think about the environmental resources.
Well, that was actually, you might say, the proximate cause, because in the late 90s, you may recall, the World Wide Web had just gone wide in 1994. And here was a system that encouraged automatic sharing, yet copyright was being asserted to prevent us from sharing.
This was the time of Napster.
Yes, it was the time of Napster. It was the time of the emergence of open source software, and then a few years later of the blogosphere and many other innovations, all of which were based, value and creativity was based on sharing and collaboration, something that conventional economics and markets don't understand, because they want to create things that are artificially scarce and individually ownable, as opposed to something that's shared. So copyright was a very important force for me in bringing into focus that we need to protect our commons. And in fact, I helped co-create the group called Public Knowledge, which was founded. It's a Washington advocacy group to protect the knowledge commons. So on internet and telecommunications policy, it's trying to protect shareable information.
It reminds me, one of my first interactions with this space would have been the late Aaron Swartz and his work on kind of public knowledge.
A real pioneer. I mean, there was a whole movement that has ebbed and flowed, but Larry Lessig in founding Creative Commons licenses to allow legal sharing of content. Yeah. I mean, a huge innovation by providing a legal infrastructure for people to share. I mean, you have to remember, copyright was based on any little scribble or guitar riff being born as private property. There was no way for stuff to be legally shared. So everything was implicitly piracy if you simply imitated or used somebody else's work. So Creative Commons licenses were an enormous innovation to do what Congress or federal authorities would not do, which is to legalize sharing.
Right. Well, before we get a little bit ahead of ourselves, my next question was actually explicitly trying to define the commons, which I think you more or less did in the first question. But one thing that might clarify is I heard you kind of a kind of critical take on Elinor Ostrom's work when you said that she focused on the commons in terms of resources. Could you elucidate your kind of clarification? Or
well, let's first introduce Elinor Ostrom.
Sure.
I mean, she was a Indiana University political scientist who, over the course of 30 or 40 years, from the 1970s until her death in 2012, studied lots of natural resource-based commons, forest, fisheries, farmland, irrigation, water, and showed that contrary to the whole tragedy of the commons fable that Garrett Hardin, a famous 1968 an essay that he had written then, contrary to the tragedy of the commons, people can and do self-organize to sustainably manage resources. And her life's work was first of all, studying that on the ground level, and then creatively theorizing to explain how and why that occurs. Well, she, as a woman working in the male-dominated economics profession, saw that social relationships mattered in creating things of economic value. That was a lot of what her work was about. But, end of the day, she's working within a rational actor economics framework, and as opposed to a cultural or social framework. And so in some ways, she was providing an interesting counterpoint to the conventional economic theories. In other ways, she was still working within what you might call the ontological framework, the premises of our human relationships and rationality and behavior. People were the very dominant theme then was the prisoner's dilemma, that in which people supposedly are always trying to calculatively maximize their personal gain, which of course happens, but it's not the full story of what humanity is about. And I think that these other dimensions of our propensity to give, to collaborate, to share, to be part of something larger than ourselves, which is arguably non-rational,
sure,
haven't been adequately conceptualized within economics.
Sure.
So the commons helps deal with that.
Right. Part of the intervention of the commons, it seems to me, is a cultural shift as well, because in a certain context, the prevailing context being capitalism and neoliberalism, it makes sense for people to try to maximize their outcomes, but in the context of in the framework of the commons, it doesn't make sense to put this kind of personal gain at the forefront.
Well, let's just say nobody wants to be a sucker and being taken advantage of. And so if the prevailing system is get for all that you can for yourself, you are a sucker if you just give it away. However, if you can develop a sufficient critical mass with protectable boundaries around your shared resources and generative capacity, the way open source software does, the way a lot of local food systems do, the way countless different commons do, you can create a different paradigm that is, I think, more humanly satisfying, that benefits more people without the gross inequality and exploitation that occurs, and that is more ecologically benign because it doesn't have the growth imperative that capitalism has. And so you can start to reintegrate people with each other and with natural systems. So, we're talking about a different mental register or paradigm for understanding the world. And so for so long we've had this presumption or fiction that the homo economicus, the utility maximizing individual, is the chief agent and way to see the world. The Commons says there's a different way to see humanity, not simply as a notional idea, but as a practical operational system. And there's countless examples out there.
On the notion of rational economic man, it seems to me when one thinks about human history, a fairly rudimentary knowledge of anthropology would see numerous examples of commons. And I don't know, it seems fundamentally a question about human nature, homo economicus and rational economic man versus a kind of collaborative creature that I think most probably social scientists understand humans to be.
Well, first of all, dubious about saying there's some essentialist human nature.
Sure.
Having said that, evolutionary scientists are showing that our propensity to cooperate seems to be inborn and native, even though, of course, we're quite capable of competitive and quite awful things as well. But part of it comes down to what the culture validates and nourishes, what it allows to become the cultural norm. And we, of course, within capitalism know what those norms are. But in some ways, we do have more capacity to create these alternative worlds and make them sustainably, not just as some fantasy or cult or isolated community. And we can see this in many different domains, from natural resources to urban spaces to digital spaces. So I think it's important to understand that this is a cross-sectoral, cross-cultural paradigm that can give us a way out of some of our very profound problems today.
A key concept in this kind of in this conversation within this framework of the commons is the notion of like property and ownership. And I wanted to ask specifically, how does our current system of property and ownership fail us, and how is the paradigm of the commons, would you say, different?
Well, property law tends to privilege the whole idea of individual exclusive control. And it presumes that that is the only way to go, even though individual property ownership tends to deny the realities of our social connection to each other and our embeddedness in ecosystems. In other words, it denies relationality as the basis of human life because it focuses mostly on simply market exchange of objectified things that have been put in an envelope of property, such that you have snippets of music sampling our private property. And in other words, it's been taken to such extremes that all sorts of knowledge like the breast cancer susceptibility gene can be privately owned, and nanomatter is being patented, and it goes on and on. Basically, there is, of course, an important role for private property, but so much private property is, in fact, corporate property, which is to say public and consequential for what the nature of ecosystems are, that it's gotten out of control. And the pushback on the limits of this dominion of private property are reaching extremes. They're giving us everything from various cascades of environmental problems and climate change as capitalism tries to propertize everything in the world. So the commons is an attempt to assert, no, there need to be limits to private property, and some things need to be collectively managed for the collective good and not simply leveraged as much as possible for market gain.
Right. This is exactly my next question, the question of commodification and enclosure. In your talk that I heard earlier today, you mentioned that the human genome is 20% of which is patented. That goes even to questions of land and public or natural resources. And yeah, I was going to ask you specifically, what would you say the consequences and the implications of this kind of continuous enclosure, this commodification of everything, would be for society?
Well, we're living through it right now, where we have grotesque inequality and shared common needs are not being met. And this is in large part driven by the private propertization and marketization of everything. I mean, even social problems, the ideas that, you have to create new bodies of property rights for example, pollution rights, or you need to financialize incentives to deal with nature, and so let's monetize how much the pollination that bees do for crops. Let's put a market value on that and create a security, a market security that can be traded as a way to solve the problems of bees disappearing. In other words, it's like so grotesquely out of control in trying to use property and market incentives to deal with precisely the problems those have created in the first place. Can we start to acknowledge intrinsic value of nature? Things that are outside of the market that should be inalienable and not propertized. That, I think, is one of the preeminent concerns of our time. But paradoxically, even progressives and liberals who are tied to the market growth grand narrative can't go there, because they see the only way to solve problems is further growth, further growth, further growth. And that's something that we have to step up to and deal with.
Related to the question of growth is, well, first of all, as you suggest, the continuous growth is kind of one of the maxims of our system. We can't even have a kind of stable or steady state economy, as it's called. We have to always keep growing. And how might an advocate of the commons understand the concept of economic growth or steady state or degrowth, as some people call it?
Well, capital is driving this because capital wants more and more return, and things that are unowned, not yet propertized, are ripe resources for the market machine. So a commoner would say, how can we create things that are simply not for sale? The state will not allow it to be sold, so that the moon cannot be sold. Even the Arctic and others are already trying to stake claims on minerals up there. So I think we need to cultivate this ethic that many things are not for sale and devise either the legal or technological or social norms to prevent that from happening. And we have to realize that the growth paradigm is no longer the tool for improved civilization and human betterment. It's becoming destructive of those very things. Yet capital insists that that's the only way forward. So we have to have a reckoning on that, and it's not simply going to happen at the macro level first. We have to cultivate that at the micro level where we live in our own meeting our productive needs. So that's what the commons can do, is meet needs in decommodified ways, where you don't need to have market exchange to meet your needs, and as opposed to market wants, which are a different thing entirely.
And related to the question of growth is the question of value. So one shortcoming of our market-centered system is the enormous amount of quote-unquote externalities that go unaccounted for. How does the concept of the commons inform your understanding of value?
Well, market economics regards anything that can be exchanged and that has a price as being valuable. The commons regards all sorts of things that don't have a price as also being valuable, but that doesn't have any standing within conventional political or economic discourse. So, for example, the value of rivers, lakes, oceans as natural systems, of wildlife and species and genes as natural systems, the value of care work that women in families and unfortunately very few men are involved in. All of these are non-market phenomena unless they're turned into something for sale. The whole notion of the economy, which focuses on exchange value, needs to start to focus on use value, meaning what's valuable for us to use, whether or not it has a price, whether or not money is exchanged to make it happen. So the commons is about encouraging use value, not as mediated by price or supply and demand, but by social need and negotiation and coordination. And that's a different proposition than the market.
You mentioned care work. I want to follow up on that because that appeared in quite a few different passages of different works of yours I've read. So, as you mentioned, the market interpretation of care work would be that it is a service that is either bought or sold or traded, etc. As you stated, I'd like to reemphasize that whether we're talking about child care or elder care, this is mostly done by women, it's mostly unpaid, and when it is unpaid, it's mostly done by women. I want to know how the idea of care work fits into the framework of the commons.
Well, it is a major sector of non-market life that is regarded as external to the economy. And because it's external to the economy and it's therefore not productive, it's not valuable in any price sense or return on investment sense. Some ingenious people have been able to turn care work, elder care, child care, household activities into a market, and suddenly it's valuable. The problem is that's inconsistent with the very notion of care, which cannot be regimented, cannot be, you can't put a price on what real care is about, because care involves sacrificing of yourself. You're not maximizing your utility. You're giving of yourself to someone else. You're spending a lot of time with them in ways that are not productive or creating value in a market sense. So there's an inherent contradiction of marketizing care work, which, the work needs to be done. People can do care work through the market that is still, teachers care for their students. Child care people still care for their children. But that's still different. To the extent that it's dependent upon the market price, you only get people who have no better options, or people who are, women are traditionally relegated to these tasks, and it encourages the whole gender divide between that which is productive versus that which is relation building. Care is relationship building, which markets are less concerned with.
Right.
So those are some of the issues involved in that.
Well, it reminds me of kind of like maybe a class that in Economics 101 that a lot of people are familiar with. You have the supply line and the demand line, and where they meet, that's the worth, right? And so many aspects of the commons, including care work, it defies these kind of neat little boxes like supply, demand, price.
Well, and care work creates a problem for economics in the sense that it starts to, we obviously know that care is essential to a human civilization in a society. Somebody needs to raise and acculturate the children. Somebody needs to educate them. Old people need to be taken care of. But, the problem is that it doesn't fit within market categories, and economics doesn't quite know how to deal with it. But, of course, it has to be done. And, that's a theoretical limitation of conventional economics. It doesn't want to go there because there's no exchange value going on. So I think the ambition should be to integrate the commons into our notion of the economy so that the reproduction of life, families, households has standing in economic analysis, as opposed to, if it's not being paid for, it's not worth anything.
So I want to move on to the kind of the possibilities that the commons unlocks. So I've read about the commons being used to support cases from programs ranging from a basic income in the form of perhaps kind of a public dividend from capital, from privately traded capital, or to environmental protectionism, or even I think Peter Barnes has a kind of a combination of the two with a kind of tax and dividend program for the commons. Are there examples you would highlight and that come to your mind immediately as the kind of political, economic, and or social programs that are kind of unlocked through a more detailed understanding of the common?
Well, this is kind of a frontier right now because the conventional state is so allied with markets and capital as the only way to get things done that it doesn't consider the commons as something worth pursuing. It doesn't generate tax revenue, or at least as much tax revenue as market growth does. So the state is either indifferent or uncomprehending of the commons. That said, there are a handful of interesting experiments that are trying to use state power to support the commons. You mentioned Peter Barnes, things like the Alaska Permanent Fund, in which the state legislature created a trust to take revenues from state oil sales, put it in a trust fund owned by every resident in Alaska, and every year residents of Alaska get between $1,000 and $2,000 from that trust fund. Even people like Sarah Palin support it. Well, stakeholder trust funds for natural resources that we all own, groundwater, forests, minerals, would be one way to protect them from simply being exploited by rip-and-run companies, so that the public could get some benefit from them and steward them so they're not simply leaving ecological destruction in their wake. So that's one interesting model. There's others in Europe. There's a lot of cities that are developing so-called public commons partnerships, where the city government is collaborating with self-organized neighborhood groups or other initiatives to facilitate them doing work that bureaucracies would otherwise do. And it's a great advance because the citizens care about their neighborhood. They want it to work. They can devise their own systems that are not legalistic or bureaucratic or lots of high overhead. And so it's really kind of a way to get people re-engaged with the city and for governments to support genuine citizen participation. Another example might be participatory budgeting, where people can have a say, direct say, in how budgets are allocated. So there are some of these things, but frankly, there are more of a frontier that is now being explored as commons grow and start to bump up against conventional systems, market systems, bureaucratic systems.
I wanted to ask specifically about the notion of finance and money. So in a lot of ways, money is a kind of public utility that we use to lubricate exchanges. But it's something, trying to do this while giving you the chance to give the answer you gave today. But money as a public utility is something that's really not controlled publicly. Now, there are experiments like with alternative currencies and things like that. But when you think about the monetary system, how does the monetary system fit into the framework of the commons?
Well, people don't realize that 95% of the money in the United States is created privately through banks, who are then able to reap, they give out loans, and that creates new money. They don't necessarily have a significant amount of money in the bank. Their loan creates the money, and they then reap the gains of that through interest payments over time. So essentially, the U.S. government has surrendered its prerogative as a sovereign state, surrendered the power to create money to private banks, and all the profits from that are privately capitalized and controlled. This means that we, the people of the United States, don't reap the benefits of that power to create money. And this is called the power of seigniorage, that's the term. Well, if we were to capture some of that value ourselves by having the government or its designated trustees create money rather than banks, we could, for example, we saw how the government used that power to bail out the banks in 2008, where they essentially created money to bail them out without it being considered public debt that needed to be repaid. And that's only because the government has that power. The state has that power. Why can't we have quantitative easing for the environment or social needs without it being considered public debt that needs to be repaid? We could do that responsibly so long as the money is sopped up through taxes so that we don't create inflation. Mary Mellor, a British monetary specialist, has written about this in a book called Debt debt or democracy, question mark. And the point is, these alternative ways of creating money are entirely feasible and responsible, as opposed to simply surrendering that to private entities to reap all the gains.
Of course, sovereign fiat currency issuers have the power to create the money in such a way, and right now we let private banks do it. Are you compelled by the notion at all of publicly owned banks or other institutions that might have another way of kind of generating this for the people?
Well, public banks would be a huge improvement as well, because instead of city or state governments having to borrow money from private banks at their exorbitant interest rates, they could radically lower their interest rate costs. And so, for example, in creating major infrastructure, they could save a quarter, a third, or more of the costs by having their own bank. A city, if it were to open and create its own public bank, deposit city funds in it, and then make loans, could save lots on infrastructure. A woman, Ellen Brown of the Public Banking Institute, is the leading expert on this, and they facilitate a lot of creation of public banks. And a lot of states and localities are now exploring public banks as a way to throw off the yoke of dependency on private banking and mutualize a lot of the gains of having their own bank. And it's entirely feasible.
And right. And now I want to talk about kind of the theory of change here. So in your models paper, I believe it was called Commoning as a Socially Transformative Paradigm. You mentioned, you criticized some parts of the left that rely on top-down notions of theories of change. Like if we get this elected office or enough people in this legislative body, we can affect change. What do you think that these pathways that rely on the notion of kind of taking political power, what do you think they get wrong about the theory of change?
Well, I think that as those top-down approaches become autonomous unto themselves, they lose connection with the people they're trying to serve, the way the Democratic Party has, for example. And they become a self-replicating political elite. And moreover, they lose sight of the fact that simply taking power is kind of a dead letter if you can't prevail on a transformative agenda or have the willpower and imagination to do so. We saw how the left took over power in Greece and how it was pointless because they were trumped by international capital. And even as a sovereign nation, they could not deal with their debt crisis because the international banks were saying, too bad, we hold all the trump cards. We saw the same thing in Bolivia, where Evo Morales took power from the left as an indigenous person and essentially had to retain the extractivist economy that had existed before because of their dependence on international capital and markets. So if we're talking about being transformative, simply taking power through the state is maybe necessary, but it's quite insufficient. And it's not going to be transformative unless it's really organically connected to local change, and local change that has a different political and cultural logic. In other words, it doesn't want to simply placate or accommodate or even support international capital. So I think that the seeds of change are going to have to come from the bottom, and they will express a different political culture through people's personal and social practices. And that has to be the origins at this point, because the rest of the system is too indentured, too tied up with the existing logic of the system. And so we need some external forces to intervene, because within the logic of the existing system, it just is not going to happen.
Earlier today, you talked about not just the commons. You've mentioned this a few times, but as a verb, commoning. And that seems to be kind of commoning is the theory of change. And I was hoping to get you to elaborate on how commoning represents an effective theory of change, and if there are some examples of commoning that you might refer people to.
Yeah, well, I'm very suspicious of novel words being our salvation. And we've seen the life cycle of the word sustainability, for example, where it's now meaningless because everybody is sustainable.
Right.
And the point is what's happening that's achieving the goal of that word. So the truth of the matter is there is no such thing as a commons as such. There is commoning, the social practices of talking, negotiating, working it out for shared goals, bringing diverse perspectives into alignment. This is the process of commoning. And this is a form of democratic empowerment and governance that can happen right now without permission from the government or the corporations. We can do it ourselves in lots of arenas. So commoning, you might say, is the seedbed of a new democratic practice. Well, Peter Linebaugh, the great historian of the commons, says there is no commons without commoning. And I think that's a way to keep the vitality and aliveness of the commons. In fact, it's the only way to keep it alive. Because if you're simply mouthing the word as a buzzword or marketing or messaging strategy, it's dead right then. And you have to have a community of people who have the commitment, the activity, and has to be constantly recreated. And this is, to put it in high-flown words, is the relational theory of value. The value is created through people enacting their relationships together through commons. So that's where I think really transformative change is going to come from. It needs that grounding in people's lives and local practice.
Thank you. Thank you. So that was actually my last question. I think it's a great place to end, actually. But is there anything you'd want to add for our listeners about the subject of the commons or about your work?
Well, we didn't discuss so much the broad range of things going on, but I would just say, first of all, there's lots of people that are, you might say, commoning and don't even know it. And the value of the commons language and vocabulary is it helps validate something that they might consider trivial, marginal, not consequential. It is. And I think that's part of the importance of the language of the commons, especially as a counterpoint to the market narratives that are seen as the only legitimate or only productive way of producing things. Second, I would point out that there are lots of projects in different domains. I mentioned City as commons, lots of digital projects from open source software to Wikipedia and dozens of wikis to open access scholarly publishing, and it goes on, which are forms of commoning that are incredibly productive, creative, arguably more so than proprietary versions. I just wanted to say that there is a broad variety of social activities that are commoning right now. So this is not some utopian sort of abstract thing. It's happening. It's practical. Whether it's recognized culturally as commons, as a different form of value generation, that's another issue. But that's precisely what a lot of the commons movement is all about, validating this as important activity that needs to be protected and extended. So, I would just leave it at that and let people know that there's a lot of resources out there. I can direct them to my website blog, which is bollier.org, BOLLIER.org. But there's other important ones like the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, which has a lot of stuff on peer production and open design and manufacturing. You can go to the Commons Transition website. And then in Europe, there's quite a few different sites if you have more specialized interest, or, in Barcelona is in the vanguard of a lot of activities of commons as well. So I just wanted to leave with that notion that this is happening. It's simply not culturally recognized, at least of all in America. Well, to our listeners, there will of course be links in the description of this podcast to David's work on our website, thenextsystem.org, as well as his blog at bollier.org. And thank you for listening this week. And David, thanks so much for joining us. Thank you.